Welcome back. With North Africa of enormous strategic interest, the US and France are taking the lead in the region. Algeria and Morocco are both seen as pivotal in the US-led war on terror and continue to receive large amounts of arms, aid and support in return. Located on Europe's doorstep, both countries maintain extensive trade ties with France, as well as being home to large migrant communities in France. Yet France and the US are not only cooperating in North Africa, but they're also competing. France sees its influence in North Africa, a zone long considered to be France's backyard, as being threatened by Washington's move. At the same time, the US has strengthened its military relations with Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, as well as signing a free trade agreement with Morocco. Still joining us, our guests in Rabat, Lahsan Haddad, here in Doha, Saad Jabbar, and in London, David Hartwell. Let me go to Mr. Saad Haddad here to Mr. Saad Jabbar here in Doha. Sorry, Mr. Saad, do you see any correlation between the arms race and the interest shown by both the Americans and the French in North Africa?
Well, there has always been that type of competition, but we should not really exaggerate it. I mean, this is economic competition, but the Americans have always held and still hold the view that, the Cold War view that, look, France knows very well the Maghreb countries, so with their backyard they have to take care of certain aspects of their of security and so on, or interests. But when it comes to the economic interest, of course, there is competition. So there is cooperation truly and competition. But when you look at the Algerian crisis since 1992, up till now, the United States has benefited a great deal more, maybe than anyone else in the petrol sector. The French have had really boom relationship in Algeria because they exploited the internal crisis, and the regime wanted some sort of support and recognition and to keep away from the Algerian crisis, or not to support the opposition in Algeria. Meanwhile, both, not only France and the United States, add to them Spain, they have thrived on the rivalry and the tension between the two countries by selling arms, by trying or giving the impression sometimes of political diplomatic trade-offs regarding Morocco for the Algerians, or regarding the Algerians vis-à-vis Morocco. So they have not really put any real pressure, because they have no interest on each side, on any side, because they know very well that there will be no sort of crisis or international tension which might be created out of that.
Saad, I asked the question. Let me go now to Lahsan Haddad, because both countries last year signed deals with the Americans to acquire weapons, which led some people to suggest this is politically motivated, because both are trying to get more favor with the Americans.
I think that the two countries have very strong relations with the Americans. Algeria has strong economic relations, and oil contracts are huge with the Americans. So the Americans have very economic interest there. And Morocco has had like historical diplomatic relations with the United States since 18th century. And I think the two countries want to continue that way. But I think the interest of the Americans has shifted from economic interest to more interest in fighting terrorism, especially in the no man's land called the Great Sahara. And I think they want the two countries to cooperate with the United States, with France, and with other countries from the region in order to fight terrorism. And they see the two countries as key to that. So I think the armament, some of it is for economic reasons, but a lot of it is also in order to raise the capacity of the two countries to work together.
Since we're talking about,
it has been a dog.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Lahsan, but since we're talking about the fight against terrorism and the sub-Saharan area seen as porous by the American and a source of concern and danger, David, is the fight against terror led by the Americans reshaping the geostrategic importance of the region, not mainly North Africa?
To a certain extent, yeah. I think there's no doubt that America's relationship with Algeria has changed dramatically, I would say, since 2001. When the Algerians very successfully managed to couch the civil war in terms of the general wider war on terror as was launched by the Americans in 2001. So while Morocco's relationship with the US has got historical roots dating back over 100 years, Algeria's suddenly newfound relationship with America has become more important. I think the Americans have come to view the Algerians particularly as key to the region. I think that they've looked at military capabilities within the region, and it is not difficult to draw the conclusion that Algeria, even before it spent $8 billion on Russian weapons last year.
And that's definitely for two main factors, which are gas and oil. And let me, for this, just sorry to interrupt you, go to Saad here in Doha. Saad, this area, North Africa, has been seen as prime zone of influence for the French for decades. Now the Americans recently, I mean the last 10 years, they have been touting the countries to sell their own weapons, at the same time suggesting free trade agreements and clinching huge contracts with the Algerians. Are we here in a situation where we can say that North Africa is shifting loyalties towards the Americans?
I think, you know, there will always be strong relations with the French for the obvious reason of millions of Algerians living in Moroccans as well living in France, and there are pensions which people are drawing from the French because they have been working there, and the geographical proximity and so on. It does not mean that the United States is not doing very well in both countries, especially in Algeria. And now the Algerians, when you go back to since the coup d'etat by the military in Algeria in 1992, they have overplayed their hands in highlighting the so-called fighting of terrorism, and they want to portray the Algerian crisis as a security problem, or in other words, a problem of fighting terrorism. And they found their way after the 9/11, and they wanted to tell the Americans, look, we told you so. Wrongly, of course, but the Americans wanted also to show that they could have global reach, and they were trying to convince the Algerians to have military bases in the south of the Sahara, and that backfired because as far as the Algerians is concerned, because the Algerians were telling the Americans, look, we have an international phenomenon called terrorism, we have to fight it together. And the Americans, a general who was an American general in Germany, said, yes, of course, you are right, let's have joint military maneuvers, and also let's have monitoring stations in the south so as to fight terrorism in the south, which is to me still a myth. So the Algerians tried to convince the Americans to be interested in their national terrorism, which up to, you know, it didn't exist to some extent. It exists, but it didn't warrant that you have to bring in the United States. And the Americans talking about Al-Qaeda, so that, you know, they saw Al-Qaeda everywhere, and the Arab regimes in general, even those who didn't have the threat of Al-Qaeda at the time, they wanted to believe or to make believe that there was Al-Qaeda in order to drag in the United States and to support them against any political change, any political reform.
I've been listening to you, Saad, and at the same time I've been listening to Lahsan Haddad. Basically, you agreed that some of the factors that have been described as being the reasons for the tension between Morocco and Algeria have been exaggerated, blown out of proportion. Let me ask you this, Lahsan Haddad. How can Algeria and Morocco, just independently, without any other influence, bridge the gap between them?
Well, I think they need to do like some confidence-building mechanisms and measures. First of them is border opening. I think that will alleviate the suffering of many families on this side and the other side who cannot fly from Casablanca to Algiers and vice versa. That's the first thing. And I think the second one is to put the economic integration of the Maghreb on the track, and they could play a very important role. The third one is like they see each other as complementary economically. I mean, especially with Algeria producing oil and gas, and Morocco producing a lot of other things and having a diversified economy, they could see each other as complementary. And I think they should not rule out from the agenda the fact that the Sahara should be discussed. It's a problem
and
between the two countries, they want it or not.
David.
Sorry?
Lahsan, let me just go to David. David, can the Moroccans and Algerians do the same thing that the Iranians and the Emiratis are doing? Basically, they have an issue, a contentious issue, which is the islands, but at the same time, they are cooperating, and the level of volume of trade exchange between them is more than is estimated at billions and billions of US dollars.
Yeah, I think it appears to be very difficult for the reasons that were described earlier on. Is that the two countries view the resolution to the Western Sahara conflict in two very, very different ways. And while Algeria continues to insist on the UN mechanisms, and while Morocco continues to insist on, you know, a process whereby the Polisario and the Western Saharans accept a deal, whether it's signed off by the UN or not. I think it's very difficult for the foreseeable future to A, see a resolution to Western Sahara, and B, see a meaningful rapprochement between Algeria and Morocco.
Mr. David Hartwell, Lahsan Haddad and Saad Jabbar, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.